more sort of fluid definition, in so much as engaged journalism is what helps us close the gap between communities and the journalists who want to serve them and are aiming to serve them. The reason that I tend to have that more fluid definition is just an understanding of how do we choose and prioritize ways that we can choose service. And by that, I mean thinking about what are the information needs. If you're looking at an investigation, who's most affected by an issue and what information do they need of their own best advocate? If we're looking to reach, engage, and serve an audience that's been traditionally underserved or harmed by an organization, what are the things that we need to do to not only make sure that we're relevant, but that we're reaching folks and that we're doing it in a way that is relational? We're going to talk later about some of the ways that that manifests, but I think it really is just I was in the briefest of ways, but then I'll just keep talking. It really is thinking about how do you design for relevance? How do you take away obstacles? How do you report with and for? We've had these conversations about going from writing about to writing for, but it really is how do you write with and for, and think about the decisions that you're making when it comes to story selection, framing, sourcing, distribution with community, and creating a welcoming space so that people have access to the information that they need.
Hey everyone, good to be with you tonight. So the way that I think about and practice engaged journalism is inviting communities at the heart of your coverage to help, guide and frame and participate in your reporting process. So the organization that I work for is USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism. And we offer 5 to 6 month long investigative reporting fellowships to California journalists. I work with some of our fellows like Agnes and Lex, who have gotten additional community engagement grants to, design their reporting process in partnership with the communities that they're covering. And so what does that look like? That looks like connecting with community groups and leaders early on before traditional reporting starts to have initial listening conversations. Those conversations are off the record, just really being there to listen and learn. We ask questions like, what would it look like if the reporter got this series of stories exactly right? And that is Ashley's question. She shared that with me. And I think it's brilliant because, so often mainstream newsrooms are deciding on content and creating narratives about communities from behind closed doors. And I think starting with a question like this is so important because it's acknowledging the expertise of community members and of their lived experiences, and acknowledging that their input and collaboration is not only necessary, but essential to get the story right. Other questions that we like to ask are, where's your community showing up digitally and in person to get news and information? What's the best way for a reporter to show up and introduce themselves to start building trust in those spaces? How could the journalism be a service to the community, and how could we collaborate together to achieve that? These conversations aren't one-offs. I work with reporters and community partners to build off of these conversations and create community engagement plans and strategies that are meeting communities where they are and inviting them into the reporting process. And I know that Agnes and Lex are going to go deeper and share examples of what this has looked like for their fellowship process. But yeah, that's just a little window into what I do and how I'm thinking about community engagement and practicing it.
Great, thanks so much, Ashley and Danielle. And you, I guess, in your answers sort of alluded to this next question, but can you both also talk about why this type of journalism is important?
Sure. So I mean, I think it's one of those things where we have to look at, both what are the opportunities that we have to serve our communities so that they are equipped to be their own best advocates, but it's also why, how are we going to be relevant? How are we going to be sustainable? And we can't keep going back to the same audiences. They're not going to be there. We have to think about how we can engage the folks who are making up Southern California and the communities that are, we hope, going to be turning to the newsrooms. When we think about, this is one of those things where for a long time, the question was why engagement? Like, tell me, make a case for it. More and more the question now is how do I do the work? How do we implement it? And part of the reason is that because as newsrooms are starting to do this, they're seeing its effects on metrics. They're seeing that, you know, the stories that you're producing through an engaged journalism approach draw larger audiences, more engaged audiences that are coming back over and over again. And depending on what your model is, those are the audiences that are going to be more likely to pay. Beyond that, if we want to do journalism, not just that's relevant, not just that's inviting and reflective of communities, but that's more unique, then we have to move away from decisions being made exclusively at an editor's table and instead in partnership and in deep listening with community.
I can go ahead next. Yeah, I think, you know, when you're investing like the time, energy, and care into growing reciprocal relationships with the communities that you're covering, I think that you produce more meaningful and impactful work. You know, when you make the time to listen to people's stories and their questions, inevitably you're going to have more nuanced and holistic understandings of what's important to them, what kinds of information needs they might have, how your news outlet can help meet those needs. And that's going to help you produce journalism, like Ashley said, that is going to have greater relevancy to the communities that you're aiming to serve. I think another thing I want to talk about is that I feel pretty strongly that community engagement also creates greater accessibility when it comes to sharing news and information, you know, thinking about how to make sure that your journalism is meeting communities where they're already getting news and information, you know, geographically, in language, across the digital divide. Like one example I can offer is at the start of the pandemic, I was working with a reporter at the San Luis Obispo Tribune on a renter's rights guide to explain the eviction moratorium. And we were doing that in partnership with the Promotores Collaborative, a group of Latinx volunteers who connect community members with local resources. And we were thinking about distribution before we even started drafting the guide and thinking about accessibility. You know, this project came after months of the reporter talking to tenants about substandard housing conditions that they were living with. And she had tracked, you know, how people wanted to get updates on the project. And most people wanted updates through text because of unstable internet access. And so we knew that we would need to text out JPEG images of the guide in English and Spanish. And we used Google Voice to do that. A lot of tenants are in that community are second language Spanish speakers and first language Mixteco speakers and indigenous language. And so we worked with one of the promotores to produce a version of the guide as a YouTube video in language and shared that in local Facebook groups and through text, and also thought about like spaces where folks were in person and put printed copies in meal packages that were being distributed through mutual aid groups and at food banks. Because at food banks was where the promotores were hearing questions about paying rent and evictions, like that ushered in the urgency of the guide in the first place. And so, you know, this is all to say, like, information is power. I think it creates healthier, safer communities. And in this case, it was like the difference between knowing, you know, fully what your rights were as a tenant and who in the community you could go to for support. And I think, like, as journalists, we need to think beyond hitting publish. You know, when I think about why community engagement is so important, I'm thinking about like how critical it is to make sure that you're meeting communities, you know, where they are, and making sure that you're meeting them like where and how they're already getting trusted information to ensure equitable access.
Thanks, Danielle. I think that example was also really helpful. Yeah, I also wanted to ask Ada, if you can share a little bit about why this work is important, and also just talk a little bit about the utility journalism team, since it's a relatively new team at the Times.
Yeah, sure. Can I just say I'm so excited to be part of this panel because I feel like I've learned so much from all of you. Like I went to like a couple of Ashley's focus groups, not as a journalist, but as just a community member. There was one about like Asian Americans, and there was one about like parents. I think it was about education. So I was like one of the community members and kind of saw it from that side as well. And then Agnes will probably we'll talk more about this later, but last year I was an editor on her project, and we worked with Danielle, and we had a community engagement grant, and we just sort of seeing how that came together for us to kind of put out a series about healthcare in the Cambodian and Vietnamese communities in OC, like, and just sort of learning from all of that. It's really completely shaped how I do journalism now in only positive ways. I guess, like, okay, so yeah, I'm part of the new utility team at the LA Times, and it's all about news you can use. So our mission is basically to help readers solve problems and make decisions. And part of that is like what all of you have been talking about, you know, kind of creating that relationship with the reader, right? Engaging with them and becoming that source of trust. So part of what we do is we do like reader callouts. We ask people like, what are your questions? And then we try to answer their emails and kind of interact with them directly. And one of our big projects right now is helping people get their vaccines. Very important. And I guess an example of that, you know, what we've done is just sort of create these guides like county by county, like, you know, how do you get your vaccine? It's different for each county. Like, what can we do? And it changes like every month, right? And I guess an example of what we've done, which I think kind of speaks to engaged journalism, is well, like I did the Orange County Explainer because I live in Orange County, and I remember sort of, you know, we were getting the questions not only from our callouts, but we get emails like but people just like worried, like, I don't know if it's working, you know, like not that, like I, you know, registered, but like I'm on the wait list, like, but is it actually working? And that's kind of part of the thing, right? Becoming a source of trust. And we would, like, we're the ones who can, sorry, but we're the ones who kind of can have access to the experts and like get the information, right? So if somebody's like really worried, and I know like they're only making the vaccine appointments for like people who signed up for the first 2 days. So like if you signed up a week after, like you're not gonna get your vaccine appointment for a while. And just like, sorry about the phone, but just sort of this idea that like, I can't help people get their vaccine appointment earlier, but I can tell them like, look, it's not just you, like everyone's having this problem. And like, if you don't get like an email for like 2 weeks, that's just how it is, and maybe you can just relax a little bit, right? And I mean, you don't need to relax, but I think that's sort of part of the work that we do, where, you know, we really think about the reader, and we want to help, and we want to be useful, and we want to build that trust. I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Ada. So I wanted to talk now a little bit about, you know, some examples of engaged journalism, and I wanted to invite Lex to go over the project that you're working on at the center. It's really exciting, so just love if you can share a little bit more about that.
Sure. First off, thanks so much for putting this panel together, and to all the other panelists for sharing your expertise. I'm a multimedia journalist, writer, and an artist. I'm also a 2020 USC Center for Health Journalism Fellow. And for the past year, I've been reporting on a project centered on the city of LA's response to the homeless crisis during the pandemic and personal hygiene. I'm looking at a lot of data for that project, but as a street reporter, I also wanted to make sure that I was connecting with the community that I was writing about. And I'll be honest, I'm a rookie to engaged journalism. Prior to applying for a grant through the center, I had never really even heard of engaged journalism. So I'm just going to share a little bit about my experience working on my first engagement project. So going into this, I had a couple things in mind. I knew that there's a lot of mistrust amongst the unhoused community and journalists, and that oftentimes the unhoused community feels misrepresented by media and coverage. So some of the goals that I had going into this project, I actually went back and looked at a conversation that me and Danielle had several months ago to recall some of the goals that I went in with. I wanted to learn from the unhoused community more about how they're managing their hygiene during the pandemic and to what extent the lack of hand washing stations and portable toilets has been a challenge. I also wanted to learn from the unhoused community and advocates about how my journalism and journalism in general could be better at representing their experiences and identifying possible solutions. I wanted to know what the media was missing when they were covering these issues and how my journalism could be a service to those, to fill those gaps. And I also wanted to give the unhoused community space to be heard and to find their own solutions. So initially, I went into this thinking that I kind of had to have everything figured out going into it, and through conversations with Danielle and then with community leaders and organizers, I revised my strategies a lot based on feedback from them and by identifying solutions that already existed. So initially I thought that everything was going to be done virtually. We were in the middle of the peak of the pandemic, and it didn't seem like it was really an option to go out into the field. So my original strategy was to facilitate conversations online between unhoused residents and advocates and journalists as well. Basically doing what we're doing here, like a panel discussion over Zoom or something like that. But after talking to groups, my plans changed a lot depending on the communities I was trying to reach. What we ended up doing was printing out flyers with some questions on them just to get conversations started. And we also put my contact information at the bottom. We linked up with a bunch of different advocacy groups, including West Valley People's Alliance, NoHo Home Alliance, Streetwatch LA, Van Nuys, Koreatown for All. And we joined them on outreach sessions that they were already doing. During those outreach sessions, we passed out the flyers and gathered people's information if they were interested in receiving updates about my reporting. And most importantly, we just listened to people. Almost everybody that we came in contact with seemed to be generally excited and enthusiastic about the opportunity to share their thoughts. And I really credit this to the groups that we partnered with. They had deep relationships with these communities already, and partnering up with them allowed us to make connections with those communities as well. We also partnered up with NoHo Home Alliance, and we joined them for one of their weekly drop-ins where they provide various services to unhoused residents in the Valley, like food and clothing. They did vaccines one week, showers, and we just set up a little table, brought some chargers, provided pizza and water, and then also offered people the opportunity to talk to me about personal hygiene, the pandemic. Later on, we partnered with Subtext, which is a subscription-based text platform. And I began sending daily updates to both unhoused residents as well as homeless advocates and some other folks as well. Right now, I've been sending daily updates Monday through Friday. I send sanitation schedules that detail all the sanitation cleanings and sweeps within the city of LA each day. And some questions that Agnes had for me. How does engaged journalism enhance or allow for more in-depth reporting? I would say from my experience, the more engaged you are with the community that you're writing about, the deeper and the better your reporting is going to be. I felt really fortunate to have participated in both the fellowship, but then also this engagement project, especially when I sat down to actually write my stories. because you can only really pull so much from spreadsheets and emails. I think it's really important that you also talk to the community and build a relationship with them. Some things that I walked away with, I think that engaged journalism will just expand your Rolodex of trusted sources, and it will also connect you to other stories, I think. It will help give you a range of opinions on whatever you're working on. You know, the unhoused community is a really big community, and not everybody thinks the same. It'll help you build trust, I think, with that community long term. So if you're going to continue reporting on them, I actually ran into some people that I had already interviewed for other stories while doing this project. And I think a really big thing is it keeps you engaged with your own work. Like, for example, going back and looking at some of those goals I had for this project, it reminded me of why I pursued this story in the first place. And I think that can be really good to help motivate you to finish a story. And then what I've learned working on a long-term project over the course of a year now, one big thing I would say is that you have to be deeply invested in whatever you're reporting on, because otherwise it might be difficult to actually make it to the end. And then I would also say, if you are going to approach a bigger story like this, that it's good to have somebody to bounce ideas off with and work with. Fortunately, I worked with Danielle, and she guided me through a lot of this process, but I think having somebody else to at least bounce ideas off of is really important and will help keep the momentum going.
Thanks, Lex. I mean, your project is super interesting, and honestly, I'm really excited to read the project when it's finished. The deadline's approaching, right? It's in June, so so that's going to come out pretty soon. So really looking forward to that. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit about my project. I made some slides. They're pretty text heavy, but let me just share my screen so you all can see. But as I mentioned earlier, my experience with engaged journalism first came last year. I was an engagement and California Health Fellow at the Center for Health Journalism at USC. And the project that I worked on centered around healthcare access in Orange County's Cambodian and Vietnamese communities. And so one of the stories in this series, I did a 3-part series, and that was published in TimesOC, which is a community paper of the LA Times. One of the stories that I worked on was about mental health care access, and that was a story I decided to anchor my engagement efforts on because it's a really important topic. In the Cambodian and Vietnamese communities, there are high rates of PTSD. The data on that is pretty limited, but I was able to find a 2015 study that showed that the rates of PTSD in Cambodian refugees is higher than that of Vietnam War veterans. So it's a really important topic, and that's why I decided to do my engagement efforts based on that story. So I'm kind of coming from the opposite of where Lex was thinking he was going to do his engagement work online and ended up doing it in person. I ended up doing mine online, but I did originally planned to do it in person, but then the pandemic hit. So we had to transition everything online over Zoom. So I worked with Danielle and Ada on this project, and we held 4 focus sessions on background, so that was off the record, with 46 members of the Cambodian and Vietnamese communities in OC. We also talked to service providers, and the purpose of holding these focus groups or listening sessions was to gain a deeper understanding of what barriers these communities face when accessing mental health services. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see some of the things that we did to set up these focus groups. What was really key here was identifying community groups that we could partner with who already work with these communities on the ground, who already know what kind of barriers they face. And so we partnered with 2 groups. We partnered with My Girls in Action, which is a nonprofit in Long Beach, which is out of OC, but we decided that it was okay to do that because Long Beach is home to the largest Cambodian population outside of Cambodia. And then we partnered with Viet Rainbow of Orange County, which is a nonprofit in OC. And we brainstormed with them on how to best, ask questions during these focus sessions, and also how to phrase questions, because, sometimes there's ways you can phrase questions so that you can get the answers that you need to hear. So this slide is just to show some of the questions that we asked for one of our focus groups. We asked 4 questions to our Cambodian focus groups, and these questions were ones that we developed with our partner, Khmer Girls in Action. I guess I can talk a little bit about the second question. So the second question kind of was meant to, we asked that to kind of talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma, which is the transfer of trauma between generations. And we decided that it was best not to directly ask, do you experience intergenerational trauma? So with the help of Khmer Girls in Action, we phrased the question in a different way so that we could talk about it without directly, bringing it up. And we were able to get some pretty good responses from that. So, there were so many things that came out of these focus groups because we were able to really do some deep listening. I'd say that the biggest perspective that really shaped the direction of this story on mental health, and also just the series in general, was the perspective of LGBTQ Vietnamese. This was a theme that came up and was pretty strong and consistent during our focus sessions. And it was something that wasn't on my radar when we started the project. Initially, when I outlined the story, I was planning on focusing on mental health tied to the refugee experience, tied to intergenerational trauma, and then tied to the rise in detentions and deportations in these communities. Under the previous administration, immigration detentions and deportations rose across the board, and Cambodian and Vietnamese were also affected, and that caused a lot of strain on their mental health. But then I ended up adding a section on gender identity because this came up during our focus sessions, and I think that really helped just make the story more comprehensive. It made it, added depth to it because it added this other perspective we really don't hear very much about. This is a photo of Meng Nguyen. He was one of the participants in our focus groups, and he agreed to be interviewed for the story. So it was really great to be able to have that focus session, to pick out that theme of gender identity, include it in the story, and then have somebody who was willing to be interviewed for the story. And then finally, at the end of this project, once it was all published, we concluded it with a community forum on mental health care access. And this was something we did also in response to a community request. One of our partners, Viet Rainbow of Orange County, said that he was really persistent about it. He insisted throughout the project that we should hold a community forum at the end to disseminate all this information. So we did that, and we invited me as a panelist. He is on the upper right-hand corner. One of our panelists was also the director of the OC Healthcare Agency, Dr. Clayton Chow. And during this event, he said that maybe one of the ways to help increase mental health care access is to hold a part 2 of this community forum. So I think that was a pretty big deal. And I can share now that we are actually in the process of planning a part 2 of this forum, which we're really, really excited about. But that is something that came out of this community engagement work that we did, because we listened to what the community wanted. They wanted a community forum. And then from there, we were able to build on and do, start working on a part 2. So I think it just, it's just really great work. It is resource and time intensive, but it really adds depth to the kind of work that is done. And then we also, just as a note on the bottom, we offered simultaneous interpretation to make this more accessible. We offered Khmer and Vietnamese interpretation during the panel. And then I'll just wrap by sharing that the benefits of engagement work really go beyond the stories. For me, kind of what Lex also said is that you build deeper relationships and deeper trust with the communities. And through that, I've been able to get different stories that nobody else has been able to report on. And also communities feel seen. So at the end of this project and after the community forum, I received a lot of messages of appreciation and thanks. I also saw social media posts from people who were thankful that we really took the time to listen and report carefully and report in a way that reflected the community's experiences. So with that, I am going to pass the virtual mic over to Ashley to also offer some examples of engaged journalism.
Thank you. I love what you said at the end. I grew up in a some people for me say the story before, so I apologize, but I grew up in a town that was 92% white. And my sister and I were often the only Asians and the only Latinas in the room or in our school. And, you know, it was very much that feeling of not being seen, not having our experiences reflected, not having things that ever sort of felt familiar or reflective of us, that in ways that I didn't realize until much, much later, like really drove me to want to be a part of changing that experience for others. Because if you think about it, one of the, you know, if you're able to take that time and just think about like what was a moment where you felt unheard? Like, can you name that experience when you said something, when you spoke up and nothing was taken seriously? And then juxtapose that with the experience of being heard, being seen, knowing that, you know, that your experience is being valued and what that unlocks. I mean, it's just so incredibly powerful. And with the, you know, with the lunches that Ada was talking about, when we bring people together over conversation, there was one moment I remember really early on when there was a conversation happening, and those are always built where you have, it's called feeding the conversation, mostly because engagement and food go really well together. And we have 5 or 6 community members at a table sitting with 1 or 2 journalists, and they're asking prompts in the same way that Agnes talked about, some sort of indirect questions. You want them open-ended. You want to invite people to give generative answers that aren't necessarily what you expected. They're not the traditional kind of question that you would do during interview. And almost every time, but I remember the first time really clearly, you would hear a reporter or producer say, wow, I've never heard that. Why aren't we talking about that? We should be reporting on it. And then you would hear community members of the table say like, well, we're talking about it all the time. It's just not in the news. And so like what happens when we get to be part of bringing that into the media conversations? I will step off of the soapbox though for a second to give a couple examples and actually answer the question. So one of the, you know, going kind of talking again about what Ada was saying, in this past year, journalists have stepped up in so many ways to meet and to fill information gaps that have not been met at different government levels. And so last year, KPCC, and I see a couple members of the team, past and present, in the group have stepped in to answer questions, and we embraced this idea that we could be LA's help desk. Just last year, we personally answered 6,200 questions from community members, while also basing a lot of our content on air, online, and through our now virtual events based on it, because we were able to start to see trends. We even, you know, I think it's funny where like, how do we do really good community engagement? How do we make it more personal? Well, we turned to AI because we were getting so many questions that we needed to start figuring out what the questions were so that we could process them more quickly. And there were 2 different times in the last year where we were getting 10 questions a minute based on unemployment. And so we knew like this was something where we had to shift, you know, we had to change some of our priorities and put the attention in there because people were scared, you know. So or at the very beginning, and you think about like we launched our invitation to have people ask questions in January, but it wasn't until March when we really started to get questions, and they were curiosity questions. They're like, how serious should I take this? And then you could feel the concern. And then they became heartbreaking questions of, you know, my father just died. Is it legal for my siblings and I to gather to bury him? People who were newly losing their homes or in fear of losing their homes. And so we had an opportunity to not only answer questions, to connect them to services, but also sometimes just to say, I don't have an answer to your question, but I see you. And the responses that we would get were just so meaningful. And I think if for no other reason, when they're in this period of serious burnout and burnout risk, getting to see the way that you matter, that the work that you do matters to community members, is renewing in a way that I just can't describe otherwise. This past year, but also before, it's also included direct mail distribution. I loved what Lex and Danielle had said about, you know, meeting people where they are. That's meant thinking about how do we make data informed decisions to get stories and information to people who need it most. And often we turn to USPS, and we're thinking about how can snail mail be an option. Stephanie Rotopper, who leads our engagement work on the early childhood front, worked with a local designer to create these incredible fold out sort of resource guides for parents of children last year who were in zip codes that had less frequent access to high-speed internet and devices they could be using. We had in English and Spanish, and we were looking, but we were able to target with that sort of specificity, thanks to USC supporting their research. But we've also done this when it comes to Black infant mortality, elder abuse. We have postcards that are somewhere in the mail someplace, but also at libraries and YMCAs and laundromats that are talking about college pathways and how you rethink some of your job options coming out of the pandemic. I mentioned virtual events, live events, you know, inspired in part by those same conversations, lunchtime conversations we had. We have a community-centered storytelling series called Unheard LA. And, you know, even in the name of it, it's our recognition that, yeah, in LA, there are a lot of stories that go untold, but there are a lot more stories that go unheard. And as an organization, we always have that opportunity to step back and think about what is our value add. And oftentimes it's not, you know, it's not that we can come in and tell your story, it's that we can seed space and we can center what you're experiencing. And you know, I think of I think of empathy. It's been a long day, people. I think of empathy, not only when it comes to that willingness to have your assumptions challenged, but also just what happens when you're moved by the specificity of someone's story and you start to see those more universal themes. And it's, you know, I'm very fortunate. I think Ada's heard me say this before, where I get a cry for a living and like the best kind of way, because you're just moved all the time. I mentioned Stephanie earlier, and she and Mariana Dale, who's our early childhood reporter, last year did this really powerful photo project that was a participatory photo project. Again, you know, there are some expressions you hear in kind of the engaged journalism space a lot. And one of them is it's not, you know, it's not about empowering, it's about equipping and thinking about when are there opportunities to say, okay, you know, like, again, like we might have this platform, but only you have your story, only you have your insights. And so last year working with LAist visual journalist Chava Sanchez, they worked to train a dozen parents on how to use cameras to document their lives. And of course, we had no idea the pandemic was coming when we started. So I guess it was more than a year ago. But the parents who often use the word love, and even as media, it's kind of exciting when people are using love instead of some of the other four-letter options to talk about us. But they were so supported and excited in the program that they documented life before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and really illustrated that even though we're all in the same storm, we're not in the same boat. This is not one LA parent experience, but many, many different kinds of experiences. And to Mariana and Stephanie's credit, when it came to launching the project online, which you can see at laist.com/unfiltered. I can't remember people's names, but I can remember URLs. You see what happens when the two of them didn't come in and put a narrative on top of people's experiences, but instead just had them speak for themselves. And it's, you know, it's really moving. And coming this summer, we're doing a follow-up that's looking at the caregiver and childcare provider experience. And I'm super excited. I can say this because they've already put it on Twitter, but we're doing outdoor installations. They were actually practicing last week with wheat paste on walls, and thinking again of like, how do we make sure that we're just amplifying these experiences, because so often they're happening in ways that are unseen and maybe underappreciated. I probably have gone over time, but the last couple of things I'll say is we're currently in the process of overhauling our entire style guide and looking to think about how can we make this more inclusive and public facing, and how can we make it something that's living, so it's a conversation where people can say, you know what, that's not the word that's not the word that I would use there, or tell me about this word choice, or can we have a conversation, can we understand why this happens, why this doesn't happen. We're always looking at collaborations and how how they can be something that's more supportive and that has, again, that centering of information needs as a priority. And then I think there had been a question earlier, but we also have really invested in human-centered design, which is a way that you're doing stakeholder analysis, that you're going out and you're starting with listening. So instead of saying, we're going to do this beat and we hope an audience finds us, we're instead looking to connect with people first and then building from there. And I'll stop talking, Agnes.
Thank you so much. I think we could honestly like do a series of panels on all these things because there's so much to talk about, but that all sounds really exciting. And I know that there's a question, I think, in the chat that maybe we can get to later about just keeping on, updated on some of these projects. So yeah, I guess I'll turn over to Danielle and Ada as well, if you can both offer some insight on, how engaged journalism, enhances reporting, and if there's any specific examples that you can point to, I think that would also be helpful if you have any that come to mind. Maybe you can start with Danielle.
Sure. Yeah, I have a story that I want to share from Agnes's project. So for one of the focus sessions that Agnes was talking about, we had planned it with Be It Rainbow of Orange County, and it was centered around mental health. And we were meeting with you, the director, to look over the questions that we had prepared, and he looks them over and he's like, oh wow, these are great questions. I actually think that you should get rid of all of them. And we were like, what? And he suggested starting with a pair of questions that was, what does mental health mean to you and what's your experience? And just see where people take you and go where they go. And I think that the greater point that he was trying to make is, we all thought that we were being really intentional, writing these questions that we were trying to take our assumptions out of, but it was a list of questions, it was in a particular order, and that order had a narrative. And asking people to share their story isn't a linear process. And that just really, really made me think about how at the end of the day, those questions were for us, we had put them there so that we would have stuff to pull from if things got quiet and we felt uncomfortable. And it just really reminded me about the importance of getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and just really meeting people where they are and where they want to go in a conversation. And it ended up being one of the most moving focus sessions that I've been a part of. And I think that's because we really went where people wanted to go. And yeah, it was just really meaningful. And this is a really in the weeds example, but I think, the greater point is that when you really meet people where they are, you can go deeper, and you really get to surface in your stories what communities want to prioritize. And I think that also goes really far when we're talking about trust building, and building trust with communities, because when you really meet them where they are and listen like that, I think folks really trust you to hold their stories with care, and not helicopter in for a quote.
Yeah, I was part of that, so I remember that a lot. And then when Danielle, you were sharing that with me earlier this week, I realized oh, I actually kind of do that sometimes in my reporting. Obviously, you can't do it all the time where you just come in with no questions, but once in a while we're doing explainers at the utility team, and really I have some questions, but what it's almost I have a premise. I don't know as much about this as you do. What do the readers need to know? And that's kind of my only premise, and then instead of having a list of 10 questions, as we're all trained to do, I was, you kind of have questions as backup, right? But once in a while, I'll just be what do you think I need to know? And then just follow them, and then just sort of use my own curiosity and imagine myself in that situation. If I was having this problem, and they're giving me this advice, what do I need to know? What do I need to get them to be more specific about? Because I'm not exactly sure how to do it. And I don't know, sometimes I just do that. And I think that's a huge influence that I didn't even realize. but yeah, but I think one of the things Agnes wanted me to talk about was like, how do you kind of put these principles into practice when the reality of it is that when you're a journalist, like you don't always get 6 months. You don't really ever get 6 months to, do all this stuff and, do these focus groups and get paid for it. And so you gotta just, like pump out a lot of stories sometimes, And I was kind of thinking about it. It's kind of hard, but part of me just thinks it's like all kind of part of the same process. I mean, like the luxury of having like a fellowship is that when you do all the focus groups, like you can do it on background and you don't have to use all of it and you don't have to be wrong about it. But I think, but when you're kind of doing stories all the time, I think it's still kind of the same thing where you want to be like open to all these conversations and the information that you get from the community, and be open to your assumptions being challenged. And even if there's something that you can't really write about, which happens a lot, I think, where you get pitched something, you think it's interesting, but you can't write about it because it's not your beat, right? So, but kind of seeing those less as like stuff you need to reject, but more as like opportunities to learn more information that you might be able to like file away in your head as information that you can use later. And then one example I was thinking of that kind of illustrates that was recently I was working on some stories and videos about vaccine distribution to underserved communities, and really just sort of trying to figure out how we could help as part of the utility team. And I think I just realized part of that is just kind of step one is just learning what's going on, right? And I remember just sort of like trying to figure out like, okay, like we know there's these clinics for underserved communities, but we also know there's these vaccine chasers. Like, so if we as media cover that, like how can we be helpful, but then also like, how can we be really unhelpful? You know what I mean? And just kind of learning all of that. And then I think part of kind of having your challenges or your assumptions challenge is also like understanding that sometimes like some information that you get, you don't think that it's going to be helpful to your story, but it actually does end up being really helpful. And I remember getting like a message from a luxury camper van company called Textino, which had told me about how they had turned their vans into mobile vaccination clinics. And that was like an example of a story that I thought was interesting, but like didn't really make sense for me to do because it wasn't like a story that fit my beat. But instead of just being like, okay, no, we can't do it, like I just kept talking to them and asking like, well, who do you guys serve? Like, do these vans go into like the underserved communities, right? Because that's what I'm working on. And it turned out that they did. And in the end, like they were the ones that helped me get access to certain clinics that I don't know how else I would have gotten access to. There's probably other ways, but I mean, they're the ones who led me to kind of like an even deeper story that I probably wouldn't have even gotten if I hadn't just kept like chatting with like the luxury van folks. So, I mean, I think that's just kind of one example of like the way that you can always stay engaged as a reporter, and it kind of ends up paying off, I think.
Great, thanks so much, Ada. And thanks everyone. So I think we're going to go ahead and move into Q&A now. We have a couple of questions that were in the chat, and maybe we could start with, well, there's also one question that was in the Q&A. This is from Zoe. So Zoe's a freelance journalist and she's interested in incorporating more community engagement practices into her work. So she's asking, do you have any tips for journalists who want to seek funding for engagement projects and use these practices when they're not working at a larger news organization? So that sort of touches on something you said, Ada, but I wanted to see if maybe Danielle, you could touch on that. And Ashley, we lost you for a little bit, but there is a question about how can we, any tips for journalists who want to seek funding for engagement projects and use these practices when they're not working at a larger news organization. And I think maybe on top of that, if we can maybe talk about maybe if there are also ways to incorporate engaged journalism, even if you don't have an entire 6 months, like in smaller ways, how can that happen? So I'll maybe invite Danielle and Ashley to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of like opportunities, I'm working at USC Center for Health Journalism, and we have a lot of fellowships throughout the year. I'm going to link to it right now, in addition to community engagement grants. And if you're a California reporter and you're interested in reporting on health equity, you should, take a look at the opportunities. And hold on, sorry, I'm being slow. I just posted a link in the chat, but I'll put my email in here too, because you're welcome to reach out anytime to chat with me in more detail about it. And I guess, and then also Lex and Agnes are both freelance journalists. We love supporting freelance journalists. So please reach out anytime. And in terms of like how to practice when it's like not necessarily one big project, I think like I go back to that idea that I think like Ada and Ashley were talking about in terms of like, it's not just about like one story or one project, it's a process and a way of being. And I guess one thing I would think about is maybe, like if you're taking a look at your coverage, like, what are the gaps that you're identifying in your own coverage? Like, where do you want to grow relationships? Like, how can you identify that point of where you want to grow and map out like who are the community leaders, who are the groups, like, the houses of worship, like all of those spaces that already have that trust, and how can you start building those relationships so that, when a story comes around, like maybe you are reporting on like parents of school age children, and you've now like done some work to build relationships with teachers, and you're writing a story, and like now you have that relationship, and you could ask the teacher to stick some flyers in kids' cubbies with some questions on them for parents. Like, that process of building those relationships will help you for those quick turnaround stories, and I think you'll reap dividends from that.
Danielle just mentioned Cubby, and I'm so obsessed with the idea of Cubby distribution as a way to reach parents. I bring it up in as many conversations as possible. I had put in the chat earlier, Gather. You can go to letsgather.in, and there are a bunch of case studies there. It also has a really robust Slack workspace that includes, it has a jobs and funding channel. So different ways to share when there are opportunities to participate in some kind of program, to get some funding. If they're not on your radar, Open News, which is the organization that puts on SourceCon each year. It's also the organization behind the DEI Coalition for Just and Anti-Racist Newsrooms, another Slack workspace. But they're phenomenal in that one of the things that they do is they offer scholarships each year. It started as something where there was as a way to offset costs to attend their conferences, but they also just offer them to help people pay for ways to learn more things. So if you're somebody who's newer to engagement and you're looking at, like what are opportunities for you to get to learn about appreciative inquiry, which is something that informs a lot of engagement practices, or just to participate in some conferences, that's one option. The Center for Cooperative Media also offers scholarships. They understand that a lot of freelancers, if you're wanting to learn more about some of like the webinars they're doing, you might be turning work down. So they will offset costs up to like $500, I think. Don't quote me because it would be terribly off in the amount, but so that you can just participate even in a virtual conversation. And then one other thing to that question about how do you sort of do this, I'd put earlier a link to a story from Mariana Dale, who just talks about some of the ways that she's brought engagement into her daily routine. The project itself is sunsetting, but the Membership Puzzle project has done a lot of work about building member-full routines and thinking about how do you turn to community and how do you have sort of this cooperative, collaborative approach to your work that can be really, really beneficial. And they were, it's out of NYU, and they were one of the first organizations dating back to before it was even Membership Puzzle Project that talked about citizens' agenda and centering information needs and election coverage. So there's a lot of good materials there to get started.
Great, thanks, Ashley. There's so many resources. Thank you for putting those in the chat already even before I asked this question. So we also had a question earlier from Kenny, who's asking if panelists would be willing to share contact info so that attendees can contact after and just keep updated to some of these projects. If that's something you're all willing to do. I'm totally willing to do that, since, you know, we're all just trying to, I think it's great to connect. And so if anyone is willing to, if any of y'all are willing to do that, great. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so please feel free to reach out, even Zoe, because you said you're a freelance journalist. If you want to connect as well, please feel free to reach out anytime. Great, we have a couple of other questions. This was a question from Mary. This was for me. It was, could you go over the ways that you ask questions that were less direct? So the example that I gave was a question that we asked in a different way when it came to intergenerational trauma. So I didn't want to go in and ask, how does intergenerational trauma affect your mental health? It's kind of a weird way to, you know, ask a question. So instead, we worked with our community partner, and they suggested asking, who do you talk to about your mental health when you feel stressed or anxious? And that way, you know, most of our respondents said they talk to their friends. And you can ask, why do you prefer to talk to your friends? You can't talk to your family. And then that kind of opens the conversation, and they can kind of talk about, you know, like, oh, my parents have their own trauma that they're dealing with. And it sort of gives you a more richer answer, I think, when you ask questions like that. Another example I can offer, which was outside of this project, but I was talking to the leader of another nonprofit group because I was trying to figure out the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of Chinese seniors. And this director was like, you can't ask like, how has your mental health been affected? Sometimes they don't have the language to answer that question, and sometimes there's a stigma attached to it. So we ended up just kind of going through questions like, have you felt lonely? Do you feel sad? Are there changes in your daily routine? So you ask more about the symptoms, and, you know, the way they answer, you can sort of, it's a bit of a longer way to get the answer. But again, I think that gives you richer answers, because then you can understand like what symptoms are they experiencing. Okay, so we have, oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, because I remember we were talking about the intergenerational trauma thing, and the other reason that we thought it might be good to not say it directly was that kind of leaving open the possibility that some people don't think that's the biggest problem, you know, like the idea like, oh God, like all the coverage about us is always about intergenerational trauma, right? And then I think the thing is, like, if people wanted to talk about it, then it would totally come up naturally. But then there are other people that are like, look, like my problem is that, you know, like I'm like a queer Vietnamese person, and I'm trying to get a therapist, and like if I find a Vietnamese therapist, they don't understand my gender and, you know, my identity. And then, you know, if I'm trying to find somebody who does understand like my you know, my identity, like maybe they don't understand my background, you know what I mean? So that's what I'm most concerned about, you know. So I think kind of just phrasing the question so that it leaves open the idea that maybe that's not what they want to talk about. Maybe they want to talk about something else.
Yeah, thanks for adding to that, Ida. So I know we're a little bit over time, so this will be our last question. But for those of you, I know there's some questions we didn't get to. Please feel free to email us, and, you know, we're happy to continue the conversation there. But we have a question, and the question is: Do any of the panelists have advice on finding meaningful enterprise stories and content similar to the various community-driven projects that have been discussed? And I'll just leave that open for anybody who wants to answer that. Is this a question we're going to need some time to think about? Okay. Well, if that's the case, then that's something that we can we can go over. Maybe we can think about that and maybe coordinate over email. We have a couple of questions from some student journalists. So there's a student journalist in Orange County. The student newspaper primarily covers university and city news. Do you think it would be a good idea for some of us to try and engage journalism? And how would you recommend going about that for a newspaper, again, that covers university and city news?
I guess I could answer that one. Hey, from Orange County. Yeah, for sure. I think this works like maybe even the best with local news. I don't know if you guys would, you know, because it's manageable, you know, like if you're covering like the US, then how do you kind of do these focus groups, right? But if you're covering your university or your city, then, you know, it's pretty not easy, but like it's manageable to think about like what are the organizations I need to talk to, who are the people who can connect me with people, who are the people who can tell me about what the community actually cares about. So yeah, I guess that's the short answer. Go for it.
Thanks, Ada. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I was just going to jump in and say, I think that they're like doing something that has like the city or the college campus as a way for you to start the conversation is so, it's definitely ripe for that. And you have different channels of communication. You can think about, how do people consume news differently, build something that's reflective of an understanding of that need. Something that I'm always thinking about is, like a win for me is when a story doesn't feel for LA, it feels of LA. And so how can that show up in what you're doing there? When we were redesigning our early childhood beat, one of the things that I was most excited about was for the first time that I ever know of, like we had like a swag budget, and like the swag that we gave out around early childhood was like owie pads, Band-Aid holders, because it was an opportunity for us to say like we know our audience. And so if you think about like what how you're serving like college students, is it something like you have like the blue light glasses, or you're or you're prioritizing the channels, whether it's like TikTok or text, or other communication platforms where people are just more often.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We're a little bit over time, but before we do, I just wanted to invite you all to, for updates on future AAJA-LA events. The best way to stay updated is to follow us on Instagram. Our handle is AAJA_LA. I'll also link to that in the chat. And also, in the spirit of engaged journalism, I'm also going to throw a link to a feedback form. We'd really love to hear your thoughts on tonight's panel. And we're also really interested in hearing about what kind of programming you'd like to see from our chapter in the future, because we're really here to serve you. So we just want to make sure that the programming we're offering is something that is going to be useful to you and beneficial to you. So please feel free to fill out this form. It'll be really quick, like a couple minutes. And with that, I just wanted to thank all of our panelists this evening. I wanted to thank Ada, Ashley, Danielle, and Lex. This was such a great panel, and I'm really excited to see where everyone's projects, what they're going to end up looking like. And also just want to thank everyone in the audience who came and spent this hour with us. Thank you so much for coming on a Wednesday night. And with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude the panel. So thank you so much, everyone, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.